In this interview, I talk with Kimmothy Cole. Kimmothy is a ritual and multidisciplinary artist, educator, producer, organizer, and activist. Kimmothy is fat, queer, able bodied, white, and non binary. Their work in immersive performance, ritual, anti oppressive organizing, and spiritual development serve as a springboard for the work of empowering individuals to deepen their holistic understanding of themselves and their communities. Enjoy. Well, hello. I'm interviewing a friend of mine, Kimmothy Cole, uh, and this has been a fun little project. I'm not doing a ton of them, but it's been interesting how everyone's story is a little bit different, but there's always similar threads. Um, and with everyone, I try to start with the good old faithful testimony question, like what was spirituality like for you coming up? What did that mean for you?
Hmm. Spirituality for me coming up felt deeply tied to legalism. And there was you know, I grew up Church of Christ and definitely was in Sunday school and learning all the stories and
Mhm.
memorizing the books of the Bible and memory verses and doing, skits and all this sort of thing. Ultimately,
Skits, the
like,
worst thing. It's like
oh man, I was on my church puppet team, so
I
church puppet.
did. I did beach evangelism in Mexico as a white Minnesotan boy, where we didn't speak language, so we did pantomime puppet evangelism.
Well,
I
and
think that's some top level shit. So, but you had all the ingredients in there: the
yeah,
skits,
oh
the
yeah, 100%.
sword drills, or whatever they call them,
Yep.
Bible verses.
And we did. I don't know if you're familiar with leadership training for Christ that they
No.
do mostly in Texas. I think there's a few other states, but it's all of these. It's like a Church of Christ convention where you come together and you like compete in different events. And like they score you, and you don't get like, there's not like one gold, silver, bronze. It's like there's a gold level and a silver level and a bronze level. But it's also this like sort of ridiculous, like, if you're a woman and you are preaching, like the men can't be in the room, that kind of stuff. So it's this like weird, but then like, you do drama together and song leading and like they score you and all this sort of stuff.
It's like some
Um,
sort of fundamentalist Olympics.
oh yeah, it's like pretty intense. I look back at it and I'm like, what? And like weird. There was like somebody got up and did this whole thing about did preached a sermon about sex and used this like metaphor about like eating a banana, which like you can guess how it became like deeply inappropriate very quickly, and like this way that was also like weirdly in this, like it was so strange. It was so strange. The whole strange. Um,
I had the golf ball in a fish net, and the golf ball goes through, and like just like sperm breaks through the condom. Fuck.
Did you do the band-aid where you take the band-aid off and now it's like not as effective as a band-aid? Like once you had
I
sex
didn't get
once,
there.
it doesn't do anything. And you're like, what? That's a weird metaphor. Yeah, so I think it was like a lot of it was just like, these are the activities you do, these are the rules you follow. These are like, if you believe in Jesus and if you believe in God and if you follow them, then like then you'll know because you will follow all the rules and you'll do all the things you're supposed to. Um,
Sanctified.
yeah, and then this kind of like, but the reality is like you're always going to fail, and like God thinks
Hmm.
you're disgusting because you make mistakes, and like thank God Jesus came along, because if God had to look at you directly, they would be so mortified by how disgusting you are, and you're like, "Oh, okay." Like at the time I was like, "Thank God for Jesus because I'm just, like I'm just trash." And now I look back at that, I'm like, "Why would you tell small children that like God is disgusted by them?" That's gross.
I once gave a sermon in my early 20s about, I used the phrase like, God hates your sin with the passion of 1,000 suns. And though he loves you, if you don't turn, you will be burnt up with the wrath of 1,000 suns unless you turn from your sin. So, yeah. I mean, so there's some similarities.
Yeah, just like feel good, cozy Christianity
Sweet.
right
Yeah.
there.
Doesn't seem like there's a lot of room for being queer in that.
There's not really a lot of room for being much of anything in that.
So
Like
there
that's
was there's no queer as fuck like gold level at your Bible Olympics.
we'll do the queer Christian Olympics. It's just like how queer can you get? Um,
Oh my
yeah,
god,
no, I mean, that's like one of those
that would be
things,
amazing.
right? It's like, and like especially growing up in a church where women are not allowed to, I mean, even pray in front of men. Unless, and here's the like beautiful little like classist loophole, women can preach and teach and pray in front of men if they're unhoused and like experiencing extreme poverty. That's okay. But if they're like a member of the church, that's not okay. And so like that also like growing up with this like intense gender binary, and then like my dad being a preacher and actively like working to like two of the churches that we were at went through a whole process around like gender equity, and one of them actually ended up like saying yes, women can be elders and preachers and whatever, and like the church, half the church left between one Sunday to the next. But the elders were like, we think this is right, so we're going to do it. And the other church, they never even got that far because they ended up firing him because he was like, we should care about poor people and treat women like they're people.
That's so communist.
Yep. So it was like this weird mix of like being in these like pretty fundamental Christian spaces and like especially the last Church of Christ that we were at was like a really wealthy Church of Christ in downtown Austin. John Cornyn was a member there. Like it was that kind of place.
Mm-hmm.
But then also like living with and like having a father who was like actively kind of like ended up, putting his like job on the line to be like, this is not okay. We can't keep functioning this way. And so it was like sort of growing up with that like that conflict of kind of the church being one thing, but my family being like definitely not even necessarily politically more progressive, but more progressive in the sense of like, most spaces, if you're 8 years old and say you want to be baptized, they're like, that's great, let's do it. Whereas like when I said that to my dad, he was like, we should probably like sit and talk about what this means. Like, let's not just like let's like actually sit with like what you believe and why you want to do this, and like be thoughtful about it. And so I just think there were some ways in which like they really encouraged me to ask difficult questions, and we're really open to having some of those conversations that I think ended up making a really big difference in what happened after I left more fundamentalist churches, and part of the reason why I left fundamentalist churches. And so it was like, it didn't feel as bad when I was in those churches with my family because my family had a little bit more openness. But by myself, it was like, oh, this is all I have are questions now. And like, there are no good answers for them in these spaces.
Well, I mean, it's amazing how being thoughtful and discerning automatically starts putting you at odds with fundamentalist stuff.
Yeah.
So, like you had that wedge that created a space for you to think, well, maybe there's more. So just to pivot.
Yeah.
So as you're kind of in these fundamentalist spaces, your family is more progressive, or at least more open-minded or discerning.
Mm-hmm.
When does queerness enter into the equation in your awareness?
It really starts, like, I remember sort of growing up hearing like being gay is bad, being gay is wrong, right? Like you can feel that way, but if you act on it, really was like the thing.
Yeah.
And that was
we're all sinful by our nature, so of course you might have wayward desires.
right.
But you have to subordinate those to the will of God.
Yeah, you need to always like be keeping yourself in check and not doing the wrong things, and like
Like
And I remember,
like a vampire. Like, of course, you're going to desire blood, but you cannot eat off of another human. You can't eat a human being, or you're a bad vampire now.
yep, exactly. It's like when I was a freshman in high school, I had a friend who I really loved who came out to me, and I did not handle it well. And looking back, like um, it's a thing that I think like sat with me for a really long time. And as I started to change, I felt like a lot of guilt around and like, but just sort of like he tells me this, and I'm like, well, have you prayed about it? Have you gone to a therapist? Like, there are people that can cure you kind of response, which is like,
Yes.
you know,
Yeah.
pretty fucking harmful. So, but it was kind of the first time. And it was like, once that sort of hit, I started getting online and like just doing a bunch of research around like what are the different verses and like how are they interpreted, and like finding some spaces where people had like a queer theology, and like sending them messages and being like, you're confusing people and you're making it harder, and you're like, like their lives are going to be harder if they're like engage this, and like you're making it harder on them, and like, and actually, like, to their credit, like getting responses back that were like very kind and people being like, I'm sorry you feel that way. Like but like starting to do more of that research, and then doing theater, and then like going off to college and doing theater and having a ton of queer friends, and having
Yeah.
like my first friend or like person in my circle who was trans, and like kind of sitting with and working through those things and having these conversations with friends of mine and being like, these things don't feel like they fit anymore, right? Like there's like all of these other things that I'm watching, like um that I've already started letting go of this idea of like women need to be subservient. And so it's like it starts to become like just like this unraveling of like um my desire to understand my friends and to get like a better sense of like how my faith fit in that, and especially like still coming from a faith practice that is very much like um evangelical, and in the sense of like evangelizing people, like not necessarily evangelical as a denomination, but that really believes like we need to like win people over for Christ, right? And so there's like sitting with this and wanting to understand it and wanting to have like the verses and the and like some clarity around that. And it was like as I continued to dig in and had more friends and had people I really loved and saw how people functioned, and frankly like there is that lie of if you live a gay lifestyle, you are going
Can't
to be
accept.
right.
Yeah.
You are going to be unhappy. Like because you will be separated from God, and like, and ultimately seeing like, no, actually, like the friends of mine who are healthy and happy and deeply fulfilled are the ones who feel at peace in their own identity, feel at peace in themselves, and that the friends I have who are Christians and that are queer and are like grappling with that are the ones who are dealing with mental health issues and are like struggling just to make sense of their surroundings, and right, and like you saw this way in which like um there became this like break between like God wants you to thrive and be healthy and happy and whole, and God wants you to follow all the rules, and if you break any of them, like you're screwed. And it was like these two things, just like I was like, these things don't fit together. Like one of these things, like one or neither of these things is totally true, right? Like
Yeah.
and
There's some. Yeah. I like the way you're naming the tension here, because like I often felt this is one of the things uh, in retrospect helped me, because I came up among Pentecostals and charismatics, and
yeah.
so even though that's, as far as groups go, it tends to be one of the most fundamentalist blocks out there. But there's this deep like assumption that the Spirit comes and dwells with you, and that you can follow the Spirit.
Mm-hmm.
So there's this subjectivity baked in, and so like when you have this the idea of healthiness and growth, it is like I think we all know that true growth and healthiness doesn't come by forcing it,
Mm-hmm.
by conforming to things. But something about fundamentalist Christianity is all about conforming to external things, and that somehow, if you do the right things, that somehow it'll all line up, and you'll be like, oh, you know.
Yeah.
I waited till I was married, and so of course sex has to be great now. Like that sort of thing. It'll just fall into place. And then you get married and you're like, it's not, I don't know what I'm doing. And we don't even know how to talk about sex, but I'm faithful. So when's the fireworks going to just automatically happen?
Yep.
That's the kind of the assumption. And when it doesn't, then people get disillusioned. And so I'm assuming like during this time when you're in theater in college, which is kind of like double whammy of the stereotypes of freewheeling queerness,
Yeah.
you're feeling some of this tension.
Yeah, definitely. Well, and like around queerness, but also just around like sex in general and gender identity and like all of these pieces of like being, I mean, and I was at a small liberal arts college in rural North Carolina. So it's not even like I'm in New York City, right? Like even in this like pretty
Where
controlled,
orgies happen all the time,
right,
24/7.
exactly.
Yeah,
It's all sex parties all the time.
all the
Um,
time.
but there was still just like there were still people that I knew that were Christians that had grown up in the Christian church that were coming out as queer, that were experimenting with sex, that were, like doing all of these things. Um and like even the tension that came up with me, like I had a friend who was had not had sex with his girlfriend, and they finally, and it was like this thing that I was like, okay, there's not many people like me, like I'm waiting and you're waiting and all sort of stuff. And when they made the decision to have sex for the first time, like this feeling of like betrayal and abandonment and like
Mhm.
feeling very like left behind, and like everyone's abandoning these things that we say we believe in, um and it was a lot. It felt like there was something to this idea that like if one piece of it falls apart, it's all going to fall apart. And so like I just have to like just keep following these rules and get better and better and better at following these rules, which I think also really undermined my sense of my own autonomy.
Mhm.
And it made it really difficult. I mean, one of the things I've had to navigate as I've gotten older is learning how to articulate my own needs and to like name really explicitly what I enjoy, and to lean into that and to not feel like there's sort of like one way to enjoy things. And if you don't enjoy it this way, then something's wrong with you.
Mhm.
And I mean, queerness is definitely a part of it, but it's not the only part of it, right? Like, I mean, there's some things that I'm like, there's nothing wrong with this thing, but it would have been seen as really strange. Um, and I think that there's also this piece of just kind of being by myself and having to, my family was in Texas and I was in North Carolina. And so it wasn't like I could just go home.
Mhm.
And so there just were a lot of times where I had to make decisions on my own about how I wanted to live and how I wanted to show up, and not necessarily have anybody that was watching or keeping track. And I was also dealing with like when I was a freshman in college, I had a bunch of stuff resurfaced from like some childhood sexual abuse. And so there was just like there were like all of these like pieces that were kind of tied up in there's this like world that I understood to be true, and now like all of it is disintegrating and I'm having to like make sense out of all of it at the same time. And the queerness was definitely a part of that. And I think not just a part of it for myself, but just like a part of understanding like how I connected with people, that there was like this way in which, I mean, there's almost kind of a culty element of this kind of like, I'm not going to go to your wedding if it's a queer wedding. I'm not going to be a
Mhm.
part of this thing if it's affirming your queerness. And like these ways in which like people that aren't even in my own faith practice, if they don't comply with certain rules within my faith practice, then I'm not really supposed to be that close to them. I'm not really supposed to like be in deep community with them because um I mean, because ultimately it's going to make me ask questions. Like I recognize now that that's like how and why that functions, but at the time it just felt like, how do I sort of live in and be in deep community with these people who I've been told my whole life are like the ones who are going to mislead me and like take me down this dark, this like pathway to evil. Yeah, and then it was like the more I got to know these people, I was like, this doesn't feel like a pathway to evil. It feels like a relief.
Do you have like a? Did you have like a moment or a season where you're like, you felt like you crossed the line between like, or was it just kind of this slow unraveling, like you used unraveling as a metaphor earlier?
Yeah. I think it was a little bit slower. I mean, it started with just going like, I don't think that I need to not be friends with people who are gay. And then it was like, actually, like, maybe being gay is not that big a deal. And then it was like, oh, actually, I think being gay is like great. And it's just another way for people to manifest. And then it was like, once I sort of got over some of the like, um, the like sexual elements of that, it then felt like, okay, well, then what are the other elements of this that I could actually kind of open myself up to? And so then it started being like having more friends that were trans and having more friends that were, um, you know, that like had different variations of human sexuality, or that, just didn't want to have commitment but wanted to have sex, or didn't want to have sex at all, and like it was just sort of like this piece by piece by piece, meeting people and hearing about different ways that people interacted, um, with the world, that started to really shift things for me. But I do think that there was like, I actually think that one of the things that kind of pushed me like a big sort of like leap forward was starting to do more work, linking my spirituality with my connection to and my relationship with, the physical world.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like once I started doing that and like learning, really observing God as creator, and if, as somebody who creates things,
Mm-hmm.
if you want to understand me as a creator, some of it is knowing me, but some of it is knowing my work and looking at my work and saying like, these are the things that are clearly important to you.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I started spending more time with God in that way of saying like, if this is a thing you've created, or this is a way that you create, or this is a process that you've chosen, this tells me things about like what is important to you and what you focus on and how you want the world to exist.
Mm-hmm.
And the more that I connected to God in that way, it just like really, there were just so many elements of that legalism that started to fall apart, because it was like, there's no reason why a loving God creates people whose nature is inherently disgusting to them. Like that doesn't make sense to me. Like that feels like a really poor choice for a creator. Like if I as a creator say like, I'm going to spend my time and energy creating things that I actively hate and like know that are going to disgust me and that I'm going to wish I had never created, like why am I putting my energy into that then? Like
Mm-hmm.
and the narratives I have of God are all of like God seeing the world and saying that it's good, and God like being excited about creation and like having this deep relationship. Um and I think even at the time that we were out in the woods, and talking about, the way in which like the prophets use language around the natural world to help us understand God better. It's like, right, like there is this very clear narrative in creation about who
Mm-hmm.
God is and where God puts their time. And it just doesn't at all feel like it fits with this sort of legalistic view of like God having a list of rules, and if you don't follow them, then like fuck you.
Yeah.
Like I just like, the more I learned, the less that those things made sense. And it was like once I got to a sort of tipping point of that not making sense, it was like, okay, then like what are other options for what could be true? And once I started to step into what are some other options that could be true, it was like, oh, these options actually feel like they fit really well in my understanding of the creative world and the stories of creator, and like
Mm-hmm.
all of these things felt like they started to fall in place, where before it had been like I have to toe the line
Mm-hmm.
on this dogma, because if I let go of any of it, it all falls apart. Like it was so fragile. And this like
Yeah.
stepping into a theology that felt like deeply rooted in the natural world felt like it just feels like it's constantly becoming more robust and nuanced and alive, rather than it just always feeling like if I pull the wrong string, everything's going to topple all around me.
I mean, it's interesting. There's a fragility to it. I think that's a good way to put it. That somehow, and this is something that keeps a lot of fundamentalists of various kinds, and I experience this particularly within American evangelicalism,
Yeah.
which is your experience, that kind of world, where it's like an all or nothing proposition. And if you question any of it, you might as well go be an atheist and have sex with goats. Like that's kind of how it's usually, and
Yeah.
it's almost how it is. So like I even remember, like this probably I'm a little older than you, but I remember when it was a big deal, and when James Dobson from Focus on the Family did an interview with Ted Bundy, the serial killer, and part of the thing he was able to do this interview, and I think Ted Bundy was a brilliant serial killer for having Jim Dobson be the one interviewing him, because the whole narrative was, well, it started as I would fantasize and I started reading porn, and before you know it, I'm killing women. Like it's kind of like that's kind of how it works. You open the door for Satan to get a foothold, and then before you know it, you're like the Zodiac killer.
Yep.
Like your senator. Isn't Ted Cruz the Zodiac killer? Isn't that part of the joke? I think, right?
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, like, so for me, I had a similar experience where like I'm getting to know people who are queer in various ways. I'm like, you know what? If I'm honest, some of these people are not only more fulfilled, but they're better than I am, like in the sense of compassion and thoughtfulness. And not all of them were Christian, but some were Christian. I didn't see their Christianity as lesser than.
Yeah.
And then I kind of became like, well, I'm going to actually be in solidarity now and like be a good ally. And then before you know it, there was a point where, and I want to get too much into my story, where I realized, wait a second, this shit applies to me.
Mm-hmm.
When did you, and the irony then is, of course, that reinforces the evangelical narrative of like slippery slope into before you know it, again, the sex parties in New York City.
Well, and there's like something about that is like, no, that's true. Like it is true that you're going to sort of open a door and all of a sudden, it's like you're Dorothy in a black and white world and you open this door and there's this full world of all these different kinds of people and all of this magic. And it's like, yeah, y'all, like, why would somebody go, oh, God, like, I mean, that's probably a
Yeah.
bad example because at the end of that movie, she goes home. But
Or
there is
does
something.
she? I think that it's really like a Pan's Labyrinth situation. I think
But
she's
there's
dead
something
at the
about
end of the
like,
movie.
yeah, y'all like you show people a way of living that doesn't require them to be constantly in fear of God if they make even the smallest mistake. And then you seem surprised that they don't want to come back to this kind of oppressive Christianity that tells them that like every little flub up, every little mistake, every little desire needs to be suppressed and withheld, and like you need to just fall in line and like be in this cookie cutter.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, I'm sorry, I'm lost track of your question. I got stuck.
Well, yeah, like we were talking about when it normalizes, when you start seeing it's okay, then you start saying, well, does this apply to me? And you see this in all kinds of things, and it doesn't have to be nefarious. So, like having my parents with children who are diagnosed as neuroatypical will start realizing, wait a second,
Yeah.
in order for them to, they stop. Like for me, my son's autistic,
Mhm,
and before I would have probably always thought about it as like something not desirable,
mhm.
and then he's diagnosed as autistic and he has ADHD, and then I'm like, oh, I think I have ADHD, and then when I got tested, and it's like it normalized it.
Yeah.
Now I didn't vilify it, but I didn't think it was a good thing either. So I had the resistance.
Yeah.
And then once you let that resistance down for other people because you love them, then you're like, well, if I love them, can I
Yeah.
love myself and allow
Yeah.
myself to ask, am I a cis het person? Am I, do I really believe all these things? What do I believe? And if I'm not going to do it out of conformity, then I have to do it out of discernment and ask, like, where am I experiencing like real, actual life?
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden you're like, oh shit, queer.
Yeah. I mean, I when I made the move from Charlotte to Austin and started doing, I was still going to church, I mean, all of that sort of stuff, and but started being in community with more queer people. There's definitely a heartier queer community in Austin than there is in Charlotte, which can't be shocking to anybody. But
One of those cities.
yeah. um,
Yeah.
but like being around people and seeing the way that people interacted and hearing the way people talked and getting to this place of being like, I think that like my whole life I have spent feeling like an outsider in groups because like when I interact people don't interact with me as a man, but when they interact with me as a woman, I'm a bad version of a woman, basically. Like I'm not doing the things that women ought to be doing, right? That um I mean, I definitely my mother is amazing. But she also is like the kind of person who will say things like, that's not very ladylike, and so
Mhm.
there is this element of just I'm too loud for the women. I'm too um I in some ways my gender presentation is very femme, but it's also very like eclectic and kind of out there. And I like different, sorts of like showing up in lots of different ways. And so it was like once I sort of went like, I've kind of made the elements of me have started to transform, and that then led me to saying like, I think I want to go by a new name. Um, and so like coming out as non-binary, really like that the timing of that with choosing a new name, like those two things felt like are like deeply linked.
Mhm.
um, and part of both of those things was sitting with my faith practice and saying like there are all these examples of people like Abram wrestling with or not it's not Abraham that wrestles with God.
Jacob.
Thank you. Jacob wrestles with God, right? And on the other end has this like new name and this like new identity and stepping
Mhm.
into this new way of being, and going through like a couple years of just personal transformation and getting to the other side and being like, who I am is not who I was, and it has changed significantly enough that it needs to be marked with a new name, and that felt like deeply tied to my faith practice and to like my like this lineage. Um, and so then with that saying like I don't feel like I don't want to be a bad woman anymore. I want to be a good Kimmothy, right? Like and like just like there being space for me to be like, if I, stepping into a non-binary identity, one just like matches politically and like sort of abstractly, like I don't feel this pull towards a binary gender in general, right? And like that it just like that whole dichotomy, that whole setup like just doesn't like feel great to me. I had a friend that called it gender nihilism. I was like, yeah, like that's a lot of where I'm at. It's just this feeling of like I want to be able to like step into myself as my full self. And like part of that was saying like I want to have a name that when you read it, you don't really know who's showing up.
Mhm.
That they're like that you are left with more questions than answers. And that like there's a way in which then I feel like I get to step into the space and show up as my full self because
Mhm.
there's not this piece that is defining me on the front end. And that felt true with my name. It felt true with my gender identity. As I started to like sit more in those things and do more of my healing around sexual violence, and like being able to sit with and explore those parts of myself. Um, and then I think like having friends who are poly, which again is like one of those things that in my experience, poly people were just people that cheated and wanted an excuse for it. And that is like real. There's definitely people that like that's how
It's
they
the thing.
function around polyamory. Like,
All it's there's always going to be messy fuckers in the
yeah,
mix of
yeah.
everything. It's just true.
But like having friends where you're like, oh, your relationships are really healthy,
Mhm.
and you're getting to kind of define those relationships for yourself rather than feeling like this is how this relationship works because we've decided it has this name, and when a relationship has this name, it always looks like this thing. And that there felt like there was space in polyamory and space in a non-binary identity, um, that felt like there was just room for me to make choices about who I was and how I connected with people that didn't exist within a framework of legalism and shoulds and ought tos. And that, again, as I like did more research, I am not a scientist by any means. I do not want to be a scientist, but I love learning about science. Um,
Mhm.
and they're just like reading all of these things and looking at all of these things, about like animals that will change their gender presentation and
Yeah,
their
those
sexuality.
condors that just
Yeah,
gave birth, the immaculate conception, or not
out of
immaculate.
nowhere, right?
Just,
And like,
yeah, no, there's no
sharks.
papa.
Yeah,
It's
like, and there's like
amazing.
sharks that do that kind of stuff, and like, In the Life in Color David Attenborough doc series that Netflix put out last year, maybe it was earlier this year, there's this one lizard that, like, the male lizards, there's a sort of like alpha male, and like they get the best food, and they kind of stand guard, and if like smaller men try to get in front of them, they attack them. But that there's like some of them that can change their gender presentation to look female, and the men will just leave them alone, and they just scurry up to the front and get all the best food, and then like leave again, and then like change their gender presentation back. And you're like, okay, that is like, that's a wild God. Like, that's a God with a sense of humor and like a creative impulse that is not about gender binaries. And the fact that that's just a thing that happens. And that it, like, there are so many stories of that, and so many different ways that that animals and people and plants are connecting with each other and connecting with us in these like really magical ways, that again, just like when you start to put a legalistic framework on it, it's like, well, as soon as you put a rule in place, there's 15 ways in which God has already said, no, it doesn't work like that. And so it's like, okay, well, then if you step back and let God be God, um, and let God be true, even if it makes him, everyone else a liar, it's like, okay, well, if God is true, then what I'm seeing from God is actually this like kind of wild, untamed exploration of love and sex and gender um, and relationships, and that, like, whether it's people or animals or plants or whatever, like, you're seeing thriving in those places where people feel like they can just show up and do the thing that they need to do, and not feel like there's that the places where you actually have people that are really, really struggling are, when I started researching and learning about religious trauma syndrome, which is not technically like DSM approved, whatever, but you can look at that and say, oh wow, like, this, when you tell somebody over and over and over again as a small child that God is disgusted by you every time you make a mistake, you can't then turn around and be surprised when they have severe anxiety and don't feel confidence in themselves, or if they don't feel like they can step into their identity and say, this is what I want, without being told that their desires are disgusting and that they're inherently wrong. It's like, well, then what do I do with them? Because I'm still feeling them, and they came from somewhere. And so, like, how do I sit with and honor the way that the divine shows up in me, and also be constantly punishing myself for all of the things that I didn't choose, that are just a part of how I was built? Like, again, it's like I couldn't make sense of how to hold those two together, and it felt like, if God is going to ask me to hold on to one of those, is it really going to be this kind of oppressive theology that makes me feel like I need to be constantly keeping myself in line, or a theology that is about thriving and beauty and exploration and deep relationships? And I mean, obviously lots of people study these things and end up on the other side of it, but for me, I just couldn't make sense of a God that is saying that, like, you know, my yoke is easy, except actually, no, I have all of these 100 rules, and if you mess up any of them, you're disgusting and I hate you. And you're like, yeah, they're like, those two things don't fit together. And like, I think too, even looking at some of the learning a little bit more about kind of the radical quality of Jesus, and the places where Jesus is just like, I mean, the verse in Luke where Jesus is talking about, you think I came to bring unity, but I came to bring a sword, and I would set this whole, I want this whole place set on fire, and you're like, oh yeah, like,
Damn. Yeah.
right, like, it's like, if I said that, somebody would kick me out of the church and tell me I was bad, and like, and just these ways in which it feels like, even to maintain that kind of legalistic framework, you almost have to let go of Jesus too, because Jesus doesn't fit into it. And that just, I think there came a point where I was like, am I going to follow my creator? Am I going to follow the disciplines of Jesus? Or am I going to follow the dogma of the church? Because they just don't feel like they fit together anymore.
A lot of folks, and this is, I'm sure you've gotten this sort of feedback. I know I do all the time. Like, once you start kind of moving into more of a radical political posture, you find people being like, Christianity is kind of shit. But then when queer spaces, there's a version of that too, because for obvious reasons, there's been a lot of wounds. Like, transphobia, homophobia, all that stuff has very religious roots, and in our context, it's Christian roots. But so why do you stick with it at all? Like, you're not just a casual Christian. You're kind of doing, you're generating stuff.
Mm-hmm.
You're participating actively in a spiritual and religious life that's tied up and bound up with Jesus. Like, why? Wouldn't it be better just to kind of like just not deal with any of that at all?
Oh, there are just so many things I love about Jesus. Um, and I think some of it is lineage. I think, like, as a descendant of colonizers on stolen land, there I feel some responsibility around the exploration of my own culture and my own lineage first and foremost, and like, where do I fall into that?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I think my first impulse was like to sit with Jesus and see if Jesus was somebody that I wanted to stick around with,
Mm-hmm.
and I guess, like, there was this version of what I had been taught for so many years that felt like I can't continue living this and be healthy who I am. But when I sit with Jesus, I don't experience this thing, like this thing that is all about rules and falling in line. Like, that's not my experience of Jesus. When I
Mm-hmm.
actually sit with these stories and I sit with people who are who have like a deep knowledge around it, right? Like, because that's the other thing is, like, you know, the Church of Christ, like, definitely has this sort of like let the Bible speak for itself kind of thing. And like, I remember I was at my grandmother's church a few years ago, and the preacher there was like, people ask me, like, what's your favorite companion text to the Bible? And I say, the Bible. I'm like,
I read
like
the Bible with another Bible open
I'm
next to
like,
it.
you're reading the King James version, which means that, like, the version you're reading is as old as Shakespeare. And when I studied Shakespeare, I sat with two massive lexicons to try to understand the language. And you're telling me you don't sit with any of that? Like, um, and so there's this, like, now I've gotten myself derailed. Let me find my way back. But that there's this way in which, like, you wanted it to sort of like sit on its own. But when
Mm-hmm.
I started to sit with people who were like, no, like, here's the contextual framework for this, for Leviticus, or for the Gospels, or for this particular word where it shows up, and you go, oh, well, then that doesn't mean that at all. Like, that
Mm-hmm.
actually feels really open to interpretation. And I think on top of that too, when you start to look at the ways in which disciples of Jesus practically functioned, in terms of having, like, small communities that were actively redistributing wealth in really radical ways, that were meeting together in secret, that were doing things, that were eating together, that were showing up and standing in solidarity with people, even when it put them in prison or their lives on the line. Like, when you see those practices, it's like, okay, that's actually compelling to me. And that's a place that people got after listening to and following Jesus. So, again, it was like one of these places where it was like, okay, so, like, I've got one version of Jesus that tells me to follow the rules, but all the people who were actually following Jesus, like, right, either when he was alive or right after, are not living that way. Like, that's not
Mm-hmm.
actually what we see from them. And so, it's like, it has been sitting and, like, teasing these things out and being like, okay, a disciple of Jesus rests, and in a capitalist society, that's a revolution, just to
Mm-hmm.
rest.
I mean,
I
even
love,
like a general strike is just a big lot of rest all at
yeah,
once.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's like,
Yeah.
there's this great verse in the Gospel of Thomas where somebody asks Jesus, what's the sign of the kingdom in you? And he says, it is a movement with repose. And I thought, like, God, like, at the center of it, to say that, like, rest is so necessary. And again, like, to be in a culture where it was like, I just felt like an outsider in most spaces. And I,
Mm-hmm.
like, between sort of being genderqueer and being fat and
Mm-hmm.
being just, like, a little bit eccentric, like, sort of always feeling like this outsider. And then, like, finding this Jesus who is also an outsider, and um, who's an outsider in a lot of the ways that, like, the people I'm supposed to be helping as a Christian are also outsiders. And just this way, like, the idea that I could be a part of a community that was being actively led by teachings from somebody who was a non-citizen, who was brown, who was a refugee, who was poor, who was unhoused, who was, right? Like this long list of being like, that's exciting to me. Like every other place I turn, including the church, I'm being led by mostly white, mostly wealthy, mostly cis, mostly middle to upper class people. The people that have power everywhere else also have all the power in the church. But when I look at Jesus isn't any of those things and is actively leading this. And so it felt like when I was, that it also dovetailed nicely with my political beliefs and my activism of like, I want to be led by Black voices and Indigenous voices and queer voices. And like the movement where that is happening is like the Jesus movement, like that's true in that movement as well, right? It's not like Jesus being like, there's obviously language around like how we interact with wealth around poor people, but there's also like, it's not actually good news for the poor for wealthy white people to have power and to tell them what they need. Like that's not good news.
That's
And
not good
so
news.
right. And so it's like, okay, so if what Jesus is doing is actually good news for the poor, then that has some serious implications that are political, that are spiritual, that are, about how I live in community, about how I live my own life. Um, and I think there are all these ways in which I had been taught interpretations of these things, but when I actually went back to the source material, and really started exploring it again, like not just the source material I was given, but also looking at the Apocrypha and, the Gnostic Gospels and just like all of these places and saying anywhere that somebody has had an interaction with Jesus, like I want to hear what it was like. And then when I kind of opened myself up to those things, it was like, man, this is fascinating. And like, I'm excited by this and I want to draw this in. And like, it's amazing to me. Like I preached a couple months ago and a couple of my friends came to listen. And one of them, we were talking about going into the harvest season and about like letting things die and knowing that like death is the gateway to stepping forward into new life. And at one point I just said, like, if you try to hold on to your life, you're going to lose it. But if you let go of your life, then you'll end up actually like having the life that you want, right? You'll get to step into this life that you're looking for. And one of my friends was like, I really liked that. And I was like, I really hate to tell you that that's Jesus, because you're probably not going to be too happy about the fact that you are like really enjoying like the way that Jesus talks about things. But like, I've gotten to the point where like I often don't credit Jesus in some cases because I know that people will immediately sort of turn off. But I mean, sometimes I'm just like quoting scripture at people and they're like, yeah,
Yeah.
that's what I'm talking about, or like I started a community during the pandemic and so much of it was just like, hey, what if we just get together and it's like a real small group of people and we just do really practical, tangible, like caring for each other and showing up for each other and like using the money that we have to help people out when and where we need it and like what to me feels like a sort of 21st century version of the first century church. And people are like, oh, that's fascinating. And I'm like, I mean, it's not my idea. Like, it's just regurgitating. And so it's like, when I start to look at like, why Jesus, why stick with Jesus? It's like, man, these are some of the best ideas that I've found, and like, they still feel so relevant and like practically relevant. I mean, even outside of the spirituality, they just feel really practically relevant for people that want to throw off oppressive systems and ways of living. And I just, it's not that there's nobody else that has good ideas around them, but like knowing that there's someone in my own lineage that I can turn to and really feel strongly about what's being spoken and feeling like I can say, yes, I'm a disciple of Jesus and hear all the things that means to me. Um, it feels exciting and it feels like something that I want to share. And it's, that's always a little bit tender because of a lot of the spaces that I'm in. But I have not found that I've dug deeper into Jesus and walked away feeling less compelled.
I like that. One last question. It's something I wish I'd been asking this question from everyone because it's not original, but it's helpful because I'm assuming a lot of people watching this one, yes, this is for a class project, but afterwards I'm hoping that, some people who are Googling find out, like, they're questioning and they want to see if they can do the Jesus-y stuff and queer stuff at the same time. And I want to believe that even now, like, someone in the future will be listening to this and being kind of animated, and maybe they're younger. Like, so I'm kind of curious, like, if you could time travel back to a point in your life when you were younger, when would you travel back and what would you say to yourself? And since it's a hypothetical, I had one person say, like, well, I wouldn't, I don't want to change a thing. I'm like, don't give me that.
It's funny because it's not that I wouldn't want to change a thing. I don't know that I could have heard much from myself for a good chunk of my life. Like, I think if 16-year-old me saw me now, they would be so upset that we were going to hell. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
And so I think it's like, it's a difficult thing to say, like, when would I go back to? Because in some ways, like, I think that I wish that I had been able to start some of my healing earlier. And that feels pretty deeply tied to some of the discovery around, like, my own history with sexual abuse. And, like, that just, it's like, I think when those things started to come out, I was able to start really healing. And that in that healing, God opened up a lot of other places where I needed healing because I was already on that journey. And so, I think it's hard to think of a specific time, and yet I will say, like, what I try to encourage with, like, the kids that I interact with, um, is just, like, really driving home the idea that, like, God is not afraid of your questions. God is not afraid of your exploration, and that, like, if you go in search of God, God wants to find you. God wants to be found. And I think it's part of the reason why I've started using things like runes and tarot decks. It's part of the reason why I've spent more time in the natural world. It's part of the reason why I've started to trust my own desires, because I just ultimately, like, it became really clear to me that, like, God didn't need me to stay in those binary boxes. God didn't need me to follow that legalism. Like, somebody else did, and somebody else was served by that. But in reality, like, God didn't need that from me. God wasn't even asking for it from me. And so I think that is the big thing for me, is, like, I don't know how my story could have been different or what anybody else's story is going to be like, but I know that God is not afraid of our exploration, and God is not afraid of our questions.
Awesome. Well, thank you for spending this time with me. And this is great. And I hope to continue to see you online after this interview. And it's been great. Like, I'm sure we didn't bring this up. You mentioned wilderness, and people might not get the context, but we met at a retreat that I was hosting, where it was all queer people and me. And I thought, I'm just such a great, look at me, I'm a good ally, being able to enjoy this space. And somehow I'm so compassionate that I'm entirely more comfortable with queer people than other people. Not really having, like, the clues were there, like, maybe you're just really queer. And I didn't get that, but that was kind of, so there's a sense in which I consider you as part of my origin story, because I feel like that was part of a chain of things that led to this. So thank you.
Hell yeah. Well, it's funny too, because a side note is, like, one of those things of, like, I'm increasingly convinced that everyone is queer, and only because there is, like, the narrow box of what isn't queer is literally just too small to hold anyone. Everyone has some kind of desire that doesn't fit in that box. And so they might mostly fit in that box, but that, like, ultimately queerness is just us realizing that we are a much wilder creation than we thought we were.
Yeah, I'm philosophically there, and that's part of the reason why I didn't really. I just thought, well, I'm still mostly straight, but I just realized that the mostly was just not true. But I think philosophically, like, it'd be better. The world would be a better place if we just realized that queerness is kind of more the default, and that the straight, heterosexual, cisgender people watching, that's cool. That's your way of being queer. Like if you're actually living that, you're like a unicorn. If you're like 100% straight and 100% cisgender, like that's
You're
good for
really
you.
queer then.
Yeah, you're super
You're the
queer.
outlier.
Yeah, it's weird almost, but I don't want to judge it.
Hate the sin, not the sinner, right?
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you. This has been a good conversation.